Sophie Walker had survived 3 deployments, 2 ambushes, and a bullet that nearly took her spine. She did not survive her brother's fiancée, looking at her like trash on the porch. "This is staff parking," Madison said, not even glancing up from her phone. "Service entrance is around back." Sophie set her duffel bag down slowly. She'd flown 19 hours to get here. She hadn't slept. The scar that ran from her collarbone to her jaw still ached in cold weather, and November in this city was cold. "I'm here to see Chris," Sophie said. "Chris doesn't know any veterans personally." Madison said the word veterans like it described a stain. "Did one of the shelters send you?" "We don't usually do this in person. There's a form." Sophie almost laughed. She didn't, because laughing would have given something away, and she had spent 6 years in rooms where giving something away got people killed. "I'm his sister." For half a second, something flickered behind Madison's eyes. Not recognition, not warmth, calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Chris doesn't have a sister who looks like—" Madison gestured vaguely at all of Sophie, the buzz cut growing back uneven where shrapnel had taken hair with it, the fatigue she hadn't had time to change out of, the duffel bags that held everything she owned because the rest was still in storage in Germany. This, inside the house, Chris's house, the one she'd wired money for 2 years ago when he was drowning in debt, the one he never knew had her name buried somewhere in a holding company's paperwork. Sophie could hear voices, laughter, Chris's voice, warm and easy, the way it used to sound before their parents died, and he became the only family she had left to protect from a distance. She had told him not to mention her. "Don't bring up the military stuff. Don't bring up the scars. Let me just meet her quietly. Let me see who she really is before she's performing for me." She was regretting that now. "I'd like to come in," Sophie said. Madison's smile sharpened. "I don't think that's a good idea. We're hosting tonight. Investors. Important people. You understand." "You understand," like Sophie was a dog that might bark at the wrong moment. "I understand perfectly," Sophie said, and she did. She understood that this woman had decided, in under 10 seconds, exactly what Sophie was worth, and had not bothered to ask a single question first. That was the kind of mistake that got people killed in Sophie's old line of work. Underestimating who was standing in front of you. Madison's mother appeared in the doorway then, draped in something that cost more than Sophie's entire combat pay for a tour. She took one look at Sophie's duffel bags, and her face did the math instantly. "Oh, honey," she said, in the voice people use for strays. "Is there somewhere we can call for you? A program? We donate to several veteran charities. We'd be happy to make a contribution instead of letting me inside," Sophie finished. "It's just, tonight is important. For Chris's career. For the family." The woman's eyes flicked toward the street, checking if neighbors were watching this exchange. "I'm sure you understand." There was again, "You understand." Sophie thought about the contract sitting in her lawyer's office back in D.C., the one that listed her as principal beneficiary of a trust that, through 4 layers of shell structure, owned this house, the company Chris worked for, and roughly 30% more of this family's comfortable life than any of them had any idea about. She thought about the years she'd spent building that fortune in rooms with no windows, doing work she still couldn't fully explain to her own brother. She thought about how none of it would have made a difference to this woman in this moment, because Madison hadn't looked past the uniform long enough to ask a single question. "I'll go," Sophie said quietly. Madison's shoulders relaxed, victorious. "But you should know something," Sophie added, picking her bags back up. "I'm not leaving the city, and I'm not done finding out who you really are." She walked back down the driveway in the cold, past the black SUVs lined up for the investors, past the topiary trimmed into shapes that probably cost more than a soldier's monthly salary. And she did not look back once, because she didn't need to. She already knew exactly what kind of house this family had built, and exactly how fast it was about to come apart. What Madison didn't know, what nobody at that party knew, was that the woman she'd just thrown off the porch had signed the deed to that house herself 18 months ago, under a name none of them would recognize. And Sophie Walker had built her entire career on patience. She was about to need every bit of it. The janitorial position. At Whitmore, Holdings paid $11 an hour. Sophie had once turned down a six-figure private security contract on principle. She took this job within 48 hours of applying, using a name that belonged to nobody. A clean identity built by people who owed her favors from a life Madison's family would never understand. Nobody looked twice at the new cleaning staff. That was the point. She learned the building before she learned the people. Floor 14 was executive. Floor 9 was finance, where the real numbers lived. Floor 3 was where the invoices got approved by people too tired or too scared to ask why a single vendor was billing 4 times the market rate for office supplies nobody remembered ordering. She learned Chris's schedule without trying. He stayed late most nights, alone, fixing spreadsheets that weren't his mistakes. She watched him from the hallway once, rubbing his eyes at 11 p.m., and felt something close to fury that had nothing to do with the company, and everything to do with the fact that her little brother was being quietly worked to exhaustion while someone else got the credit. Madison worked on 14 now, Vice President of Client Relations, a title that meant nothing except that her last name opened doors. She did not recognize Sophie. Of course she didn't. To Madison, the woman emptying her trash can was furniture. "Can you do that later?" Madison said one evening. Not a question, not looking up. "I'm on a call." Sophie did it later. 2 weeks in, she watched Madison's father, the company CFO, sign off on an invoice for consulting services that traced back to a shell company Sophie recognized immediately because she had spent a decade learning to recognize exactly this kind of structure. It was the same architecture she used to hide her own money. The difference was that her structures were legal. This one wasn't. She started keeping records. Photographs of documents left on desks past hours. Timestamps. A flash drive she kept taped beneath a shelf in the supply closet because some habits from a previous life never fully left a person. The mistreatment continued in smaller, sharper ways than the porch had been. A coffee spilled near her feet and never apologized for. A name mispronounced on purpose because correcting it once hadn't been worth the effort. Twice was a joke. Being told to take the service elevator, even when it was broken, and the stairs went up 9 flights. She absorbed all of it the way she'd been trained to absorb things. Without flinching, without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction, cataloging every slight the way she cataloged every document. Chris almost saw her once. She turned a corner too fast near the stairwell, and there he was, jacket off, tie loosened, looking 5 years older than the last time she'd actually spoken to him as herself. He glanced at her, at the gray uniform, the cart, the badge with a name that wasn't hers, and looked straight through her the way exhausted people look through anyone who isn't currently a problem they have to solve. It hurt more than the porch had. She told herself it shouldn't. She told herself this was the point, to see exactly how he was being treated, when nobody thought anyone with power was watching. But some part of her had hoped, stupidly, that he'd somehow know her anyway. That blood would announce itself even through a janitor's uniform. It didn't. And that told her something true about how invisible this family had made people like her. By the 3rd week, she had what she needed. Fraudulent invoices spanning 14 months. A pattern of blame that always landed on Chris's desk right before bonus season, conveniently clearing the path for Madison's promotion. A kickback structure running through her own father-in-law-to-be's signature, dressed up as routine vendor management. She also had a date, the Whitmore Anniversary Gala. 600 guests, every board member, every major investor, and a planned announcement that Madison would be named the company's next CEO, a decision Sophie's own holding company would technically have to approve, since nobody in that boardroom had ever bothered to learn whose signature actually sat behind the controlling trust. They had spent months building a celebration around a lie. Sophie spent that same time deciding exactly how loudly the truth was going to walk through the door. She put in her 2 weeks, noticed the same week the gala invitations went out. Her supervisor barely registered her leaving. Nobody asked where she was going. Nobody ever did. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel had been transformed into something out of magazine spread. Gold linens, a 40-foot screen behind the stage for the celebratory retrospective video, 600 chairs filled with the city's wealthiest faces, investors in tailored suits, board members trading quiet handshakes, media credentialed and waiting near the side entrance, hungry for a clean, photogenic story about a 100-year-old company crowning its bright new future. Madison stood near the stage and addressed the color of champagne, glowing under the lights, rehearsing her acceptance speech in her head one final time. Tonight she would be named CEO. Tonight the Whitmore name would belong to her, fully, the way she'd always believed it should. Chris sat 3 rows back, in a suit that didn't quite fit right, because he bought it secondhand and never had it tailored, watching the woman he loved prepare to take credit for a year of his unpaid exhaustion. He didn't know yet that tonight would be the last night he ever wore that particular kind of smallness. At exactly 8 o'clock, the chairman of the board stepped to the podium, tapped the microphone, and smiled the practiced smile of a man about to deliver good news. Before we begin tonight's announcement, he said, "I've been asked to make a brief statement. It appears a majority shareholder of Whitmore Holdings has arrived and has requested the floor." A murmur rippled through the room. Nobody on that stage, not Madison, not her father, not the board members who had run this company for a decade believing they answered to no one above themselves, had ever met the silent partner behind the trust that held controlling interest. The structure had been built that way on purpose, years ago, by a woman who understood that real power doesn't need to announce itself until the moment it matters. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Sophie Walker walked in wearing a white pantsuit cut with the precision of a dress uniform. Her posture the same posture that had once stood at attention in rooms where mistakes cost lives. The scar along her jaw caught the light. She did not rush. She had spent 6 years learning that the people who in a room are the people who refuse to hurry through it. Madison's face went through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and something close to panic, because the woman walking toward the stage was both the veteran she'd hosed off her porch and the janitor she'd ignored for 3 weeks, and those 2 people were apparently, impossibly, the same person who now owned the floor she was standing on. "Good evening," Sophie said, taking the microphone without asking for it. Her voice carried the weight it had been trained to carry, calm and unshaking. "Most of you don't know me. That was intentional. I've spent the last several weeks working in this building as a member of the cleaning staff, which means I spent the last several weeks watching exactly how this company actually operates when its leadership believes no one of consequence is paying attention." The room went still in particular way rooms go still right before something irreversible happens. "My name is Sophie Walker. I am the founder and principal of Crestline Holdings, the trust that has held controlling interest in this company for the past 4 years. I am also Chris Walker's sister." Chris's head turned so fast, he nearly knocked over his water glass. He stared at her, at the scar, at the posture, at a face he hadn't seen in person in 2 years because she'd told him to wait. Let her come quietly. Let her see things clearly before anyone started performing. Understanding moved across his face slowly, and then all at once, the way realizations do when they rearrange everything a person thought they knew. 6 weeks ago, Sophie continued, I came to this family's home to meet the woman my brother intended to marry. I was turned away at the door, mistaken for a charity case, told to use the service entrance. I said nothing, because I wanted to know who this family really was before I let them know who I was. She let that sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. What I found working inside these walls was worse than rudeness. She nodded, and the giant screen behind her, the one meant for tonight's celebratory retrospective, lit up instead with scanned documents, dates, signatures. 14 months of falsified vendor invoices, totaling just under $2.8 million, routed through a shell entity registered to an address that traces back to this company's CFO. She looked directly at Madison's father, who had gone the color of old paper. Kickback structures dressed up as consulting fees. A pattern of blame consistently assigned to one employee. Her eyes moved briefly to Chris, whose actual job was cleaning up the mess well enough that no one upstairs ever had to notice it was being made. Gasps moved through the crowd in a wave. Phones came out. The media near the side doors stopped, looking bored. Sophie clicked forward. Security footage played. Madison on camera, instructing a junior employee to alter a timestamp on a report. Audio, pulled from a recorder Sophie had carried in her cleaning cart, of Madison's father explaining to another executive exactly how to structure the next round of fraudulent billing, so it would clear the auditors. I am formally exercising my authority as controlling shareholder, Sophie said, to remove the current CFO from his position effective immediately, pending a full independent audit and likely referral to federal authorities. I am also withdrawing support for tonight's planned CEO appointment. Madison's composure finally cracked. You can't, you're not even on the board, you're a janitor, Sophie finished for her, evenly. Yes, you made that very clear, several times, while I emptied your trash can and watched your father commit fraud. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'd also like to address something personal, since we're all here. 6 weeks ago, your family told a decorated veteran to use the service entrance. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask what I'd survived to get home. You looked at a uniform and a duffel bag and decided I was worth nothing before I'd said a single word. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of leadership you'd have brought to this company. She turned, finally, to Chris, and her voice softened in a way it hadn't all evening. I'm appointing my brother interim CEO, not because he's family, because for 14 months he absorbed blame that wasn't his and never once cut a corner to make his own life easier. That's the only kind of person I trust to run something I spent years protecting. Chris stood slowly, still half in shock, and walked toward the stage past a room full of people who, 6 weeks ago, had watched him date a woman whose family treated him like hired help and said nothing. Now they watched him differently, not because his sister was rich. Sophie made sure of that in her closing words, but because he'd been worth respecting the entire time, and nobody had bothered to look. Madison's mother was already pulling her toward the exit. Her father stood frozen under the screen, still replaying his own voice back to the room. Security moved in, quiet and procedural, the way it does when the people being removed are too stunned to resist. Sophie set the microphone down. She didn't smile. She hadn't done this for satisfaction. She'd done it because somewhere between a porch in November and a janitor's car on the 9th floor, she decided that the people who mistake humility for weakness deserved to learn exactly how wrong they were. Once clearly and completely, the cameras kept flashing. Sophie walked off the stage the same way she'd walked in. Unhurried, unbothered, already thinking about the next thing that needed fixing. She still had a house to deal with.